Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today's episode is not going to be part of a series, but I am going to be using these parts later on in one of my builds, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see these again. But the plan for today is to build a wired, or what they call a loaded, pickguard by putting in the pots, the switch, and the pickups. Before we get started with the wiring, let me show you some more detail about these parts that I've got here. Now obviously I'm doing this project for a Stratocaster, so I've got a Stratocaster pickguard here. This is an 11-hole pickguard, so that's a standard for a Stratocaster, a modern one anyway. This is an aged yellow model, so it's kind of got to look like it's been out in the sun. Comes with the screws, comes with the back plate. I'm not going to use either one of those two things today. I'm just using the base pickguard. For pickups, I'm going to be using this set of Ogden Alnico 5 pickups. This box came to me and it looks like it may have been opened previously, but let me go ahead and do a little bit of an unboxing here. So they come in this nice little box with a wooden, I don't know, almost like a pickguard or a presentation slot. They've got fiber bobbins and they've got nice cloth wiring, and they come with the screws and surgical tubing spacers for the pickups to replace what would have been springs. They're labeled neck middle bridge, and let's go ahead and get a quick reading on an ohm meter. So here on the meter, the bridge is reading out at 6.8K, the middle reads 6.3, 6.4K, and the neck reads 6.2 or 6.3K. These are the only Fender parts that I'm going to use in the build. I've got a Fender 5-way switch, which is an Oak Grigsby style 5-way switch, and I've got a set of the Fender cream volume and tone knobs. And then I've got a set of capacitors that I have left over from previous Fender builds, but these are 0.022 microfarad capacitors. And then finally are my pots. I've got a set of Fleor pots. I've not used these before, but I'm going to try them out. They're full-size Imperial threaded and Imperial splined split shaft pots. And I'm going to get some of these on an ohm meter and see how they measure out, but they're supposed to be 250K. All right, well, with a quick read on my ohm meter, these are pretty close. This one is 235K. This one is 248K, and I'll check the other ones, but I suspect they're all pretty close. By the way, these pots come with nuts washers and lock washers, and I'm a little bit disappointed they didn't come with two nuts, but they are short shaft pots, so that shouldn't be a problem. And I suppose technically there is one other part that I didn't show earlier, and that's a little bit of cloth pushback wire to complete my connections between the pots. Other than that, I wanted to show you a little bit about the tools that I'll be working with and some of the supplies that you'll need. And one of those is, of course, solder. I've got two different types. I've got a 60-40 ratio solder, and I've got a 63-37 ratio solder. They're both almost equivalent. I'm using 1mm diameter solder, and I mostly use that to make connections to the back of the pots. And then I've got a 0.8mm solder that I sometimes use instead to make connections on the pots themselves or in some of the smaller eyelets on the switch and things like that. I've got an X-Acto knife because that helps when you're making adjustments to a pickguard. Then I've got a solder sucker and some solder braid in case I make a mistake. And then of course the biggest thing that I'm going to be using today is this soldering station, and I use a regular chisel tip. My tip's a little bit dirty right now, but I'll clean that up. And then I've got a wet sponge, and I've also got a little bit of a tip cleaner. It's almost like a metal Brillo pad or similar. That'll clean extra solder off of the tip, and then I usually use my sponge to make the tip nice and shiny. This soldering station, by the way, has adjustable heat settings, and I can use a medium setting, usually maybe 3/4 heat to make most of my connections, but if I'm soldering to the back of a pot, I'll often turn it all the way up. So here's the back view of the pickguard, and it has all the full shielding over all the electronic areas. The only problem was when these things come new, they do not have the cutouts for any of the components like the screws, switch, or the pots. So that's where your X-Acto knife comes in handy, and I'll show you a quick clip of me cutting this thing out. Alright, my next step is going to be to physically mount some of these components. Brand new pickguards often have between 1 and 2 layers of clear plastic film on top. You'll want to take that off before you do your final mounting. I'm going to leave it on now. If I was actually going to install this on a guitar, I would install these components, do all my wiring, and then remove the screws and nuts that are on top of this plastic, peel the plastic, and reinstall all those. So there's multiple steps on this. I'm just going to show you the basic wiring. So let's get started with mounting. When I'm mounting a Fender 5-way switch, I usually put the side with the sticker toward the outside of the pickguard, or basically the side with the big bracket here on the outside. If you buy the Fender kit, the switch comes with the screws. Now when I'm mounting the volume and tone controls, I always mount the volume control so that the eyelets are facing in, and then I mount the tone controls so that the eyelets are facing each other. Don't forget to install your lock washer before you put these through the pickguard. So that's the basic orientation. When you're installing pots in a Fender pickguard, the ideal place or height for the pots to end up is so that there's maybe one thread sticking through that top of that nut. You really don't want much of the threads from the pot to be exposed at all, because it makes your knobs sit up much higher. And then when you're mounting your pickups, the easiest way to do that is to put the screws through the pickguard first, put the springs, or in my case the surgical tubing, over them, then lay the pickup on top of them. Alright, that completes basic assembly, so now we can start to do some wiring. Before you get started with your wiring, if you don't do this often, go out on the internet and download a basic Strat wiring diagram. I often use a site called guitarelectronics.com because they have free access to a lot of common wiring diagrams, and the Stratocaster is one of the most common wiring diagrams you'll ever come across. Now to get started with your wiring after you get everything mounted, one of the things I like to do is to go ahead and route all your pickup wires. Get your neck pickup running right alongside your middle pickup and put a piece of heat shrink tubing right around there, maybe tape, whatever is easier for you. Route in your bridge pickup and put a piece right there. That gets everything set up so that it can be wired to your switch, and then you've got your grounds right next to each other. It's just going to make everything nice and clean. And generally, Strat bodies are routed with a channel right down the middle for your wires to run through. So that's where these are going to sit. Now, I have already started just a bit on the wiring on the switch. There are two common leads on the switch that need to be connected together so that the left side of the switch is connected to the right side of the switch. And then those two common leads are going to run to the volume pot. I've already soldered these two leads because they're very hard to do while you're watching me on camera, but I can solder this one while we're watching. Alright, well on this I've got my soldering iron set to about 75% of its total wattage. And when I solder, I like to try to heat the eyelet and not the thing that is passing through the eyelet. So you want to heat the ring and not the pin that's sticking through the ring. Okay, and the other thing is that you want to try to wrap wires around the edges of these eyelets in the pots themselves. You'll want to stick the wire through the eyelet, then wrap it around, and then again, I'm going to try to heat the eyelet, and I want to touch this solder to the eyelet and not to the wire. And you can stop basically when you fill the eyelet. I want to point out that in this shop, my smoke does not get in my face, but if the smoke does get in your face, you want to get a fan, because that smoke is not healthy. Okay, well I've left enough slack in this volume wire to route it wherever my pickup leads end up so that it sort of all looks pretty and they all head the same direction. Just something I like to do for aesthetics. Next, I'm going to wire the capacitor. Another thing I'm going to do is put a piece of tubing on the leg of the capacitor as it passes between the pots, and that's just extra insurance in case the pots move, that I don't get any sort of grounding problem. Again, you stop applying solder once you fill that eyelet. You don't need any more than that. I'm using this 6337 solder in the eyelets, but I've got to switch to the 6040 for the back of the pot. And I'm also going to turn my soldering iron up to full setting. Now on the backs of these pots, I like to put a bead of solder, a pretty good bead of solder, on the end of my iron, and that helps me transfer some heat to the metal on the back of this pot, which is quite thick. By the way, I've never used these Fleor pots before, but I'm quite impressed with the way that they take solder on the backs. Moving on with the wiring, next comes the pickups, and I've got the grounds on the backs of the pots, and I've actually already soldered those in just because they were kind of in the way. Set your soldering gun on high, hit each one of those, get them wired to the back of the pot. That gets all of your pickups grounded. Then your hot wires for your pickups need to go to the switch. And you've got neck, middle, bridge. Of course, that takes care of one side of your switch because we've already done the common. The other side of the switch is going to be dedicated to your tone controls, which are going to go this way, obviously. So we just need to solder in these lugs here. That takes care of the pickups, and now I'm going to run my ground wire between these 3 pots. I've already taken a piece of pushback wire and I've trimmed it to the right length. One of the things that I like to do is cut the wire shielding in the middle. So just use your strippers and basically cut around the edges of the wire and pull one back. Then you kind of push the wire back this way, push the wire back this way, and expose a middle piece so that when you go through and attach this ground wire to the backs of the pots, it connects in all 3 places with the same wire. So you don't have a piece of wire from here to here and a piece of wire from there to there. You got one wire all the way across. Now there is some argument, I should say, about the need to ground all 3 pots together when you've got this piece of shielding across the whole pickguard. I have sometimes relied upon the shielding of the pickguard to do this connection, but there's not going to be much hurt in installing this ground wire between these 3 pots, and that is the vintage correct way. So that takes care of the ground between all 3 pots, and really all I have left is the tone controls. So the middle lug of this back pot will go to the middle tone control, which is not the furthest one, but the second one up on here. And then of course the neck tone control is this one, and it will go to this back lug here on the switch. Alright, well what you might have seen me doing there is connecting these wires to the lugs on the pot and bending the wires around the lug with a little screwdriver. You can do that with a pair of pliers or whatever works for you, but the goal is to get a mechanical connection from the wire to the lug that would survive even if the solder failed. Alright, something that's important to note is that the traditional Strat routing is only going to provide enough space for each one of these 3 single coils, barely bigger than the single coils themselves. And then the control cavity is going to be routed basically straight across this line between the switch and the pot, and then around all of this other stuff. So there's going to be a large triangle under the pickguard like that. You want to make sure that all your wires fit within this sort of triangle. So you want to make sure that the routing of these wires goes kind of across this pot, right along this line of the magnets in this pickup, and that'll make sure that your wires pass through in most Strat bodies. Okay, so at this point my wiring is almost done. The only connection that I have not made yet is for the jack, and also I'll wire in a lead wire for the tremolo ground. So that means 2 more black wires and 1 white wire that's not connected to anything really, because remember, you've got to pass the wires through the body before they can be wired to the jack or soldered to the jack, and same for the tremolo. But I'll get those connections started here so those wires are there whenever this pickguard is installed. Alright, well I've got some wires cut, and I don't know what length these are, but say roughly 8 inches is about right to connect most jacks and most bridges. So you may not need that much, but I like to leave some extra in case I want to twist some wires together. I didn't really show you the beauty of pushback wire, and let me show you that now. The beauty of pushback wire is that you can cut it off to length, and then you literally just push the shielding back with your fingers, and there's no stripping involved. So that is the beauty of pushback wire, and if I let you go without showing you that, it'd be criminal, because this stuff is pretty awesome. Alright, well I'm going to use this one as my bridge ground, and this one, these 2 actually, as my jack wiring. So I'll go ahead and give these a little bit of a twist. That will help shield the hot wire with the ground wire wrapped around it. So at this point I've done all my wiring, and if I want to do a little bit of a test to make sure I got things right, you can place your ohm meter on the output jack wires and read the pickups with the switch in each of its 3 different main positions. So right now the switch is on the neck pickup and I'm getting a 6.2, 6.3 reading. Middle pickup getting a 6.3, 6.4 reading. And then bridge pickup is a 6.8, 6.9 reading. So everything is reading correctly, and I know that my pickups signals are getting to my output jack. Last steps to complete a pickguard are to install the aesthetic pieces like the pickup selector switch tip. And then I guess the one point I'll make about knobs is whatever pots you picked, if you picked a Imperial or a 24 tooth splined pot, you'll need to order the corresponding knob that goes with that. US spec pots are typically 24 spline, and import spec pots are typically 18 tooth spline. These are Fender spec knobs, so they're US spec. Some people install them where the word, volume, tone, or whatever reads correct to them when they're looking at it at maximum volume. That's pretty close to where I like it, but I like to dial mine back so that the 10 points at this pickup. And each one of the other knobs is going to orient the same way. So I like to install them just like that, where the 10s are all essentially pointing at the user. Alright, well I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and I hope you learned something from the assembly of this loaded pickguard here. I'm going to be using this pickguard in an upcoming project, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see that. Thank you all for the likes and the comments. I appreciate you guys checking out my Amazon links, and remember, all the parts in this episode will be available through those in the description. So thank you all, and I'll see you next time.